Okay, I want to do a quick video on a book that has been making the rounds the past few weeks or months, and it's called The Great Taking. It's by David Rogers Webb. Now, Webb actually was an asset manager. He had a career running investments for a few different firms and had a tremendously good performance track record. He wrote this book to alert people to what I would describe as quite a potentially alarming, potentially catastrophic risk having to do with your custody of your own assets and the idea that under certain circumstances they could be taken. And in fact, the author actually posits a worst case scenario of like a potential mass taking under some sort of created emergency. And I bring up this book not to be alarmist or not to alarm you, but more what I want you to do is read the book. It's about 130 pages, so it's not that long. And what it did for me is it got me thinking about the nature of custody relationships and the nature of my ownership and who's between me and my assets in the modern era. And I've talked before about Bitcoin on this channel. In the sense that Bitcoin is an asset that is no one else's liability, that you can self-custody. And of course, you can hold your Bitcoin at a cryptocurrency exchange, but they own your cryptocurrency, right? The custodian has access to it, and so they could take it. Now, obviously there's legal things in place that would potentially stop them, but at the end of the day, whoever has your keys has your coins, right? And so the nice thing about Bitcoin is it is a digital commodity that you yourself can custody, and there is no one who can take it from you. No one who can, break the SHA-256 cryptography and actually figure out what your keys are. It's something you own, and it can be something that nobody knows about, right? So it's your own genuine property. I sort of distinguish this type of investment or type of property from, for example, investments, which are all held with intermediaries. And this is a problem of modernity, right? Say 2 or 3 generations ago, there were equities you would print out stock certificates and you could hold the stock certificate yourself physically. And this would endow you with the right to the percent ownership in a company, for example. And there are almost no I don't know of any stock certificates anymore. All of these equity ownership positions are handled electronically through a custody agent, right? And so your broker represents to you your brokerage account with your assets. And just a few videos ago, we talked about how those assets are segregated. And so they belong to you in case the brokerage firm goes bankrupt. But this author actually goes through a pretty rigorous legal argument, and he goes through various documents and various legal laws that have been put in place for custodying of assets and circumstances under which those assets, which you would think are yours, could be taken under certain circumstances of, say, a great big collateral call. You can imagine like a scenario where somebody has a huge derivative book that blows up on them, and there's collateral taken from all sorts of different things automatically because of these sort of transfer rules that are in place. And the author goes through documents from the EU, documents from the United States, and makes a fairly alarming case that there is sort of a way to potentially take certain assets under some sort of created emergency. And I guess this is another thing that gets you thinking. The last 3 years, we saw kind of a created emergency, right? We had the pandemic, we had all the lockdowns that happened, we had sort of kind of a medical authoritarianism that happened for a period of time there. And, we kind of had rights taken away that we thought we had, right? And this does get you to think about, okay, I have my brokerage account and I have my bank account, and those things are mine. But in reality, there are certain circumstances where those things could be taken. You could also think about, say, if you become a political dissident in a country, for example, there's very little that would stop the authorities from just taking your stuff, And so, I don't know if this author is precisely right in how he articulates his thesis. Maybe that's not even the point. The point is to get you to think about the nature of your sovereignty over your assets, who the intermediaries are between you and the property you own, and are there risks there, right? And then I'll leave you with one other sort of powerful anecdote that the author gives by analogy to sort of illustrate the type of example. It's a different time and a different example, but he described during the Great Depression in the United States that President Roosevelt in 1933 declared a bank holiday, basically shut down the whole nation's banking system and all the banks. And then after the holiday was over, the Federal Reserve reopened certain chosen banks. They didn't open every bank, right? And so the banks that were opened basically ran and functioned like normal banks. The banks that were not opened were shut down. The loans that those banks held were consolidated at the banks that were opened. You can read this all throughout the book, and I'll link to this book in the description below this video. But basically what happened was a lot of people lost money from their deposits at banks that were closed down, but the loans that those people had borrowed, which are assets on the bank's balance sheets, those loans were transferred to banks that were allowed to stay in business. So if you think about it, and he gave an example of some of his people that were his parents' and grandparents' generation in Cleveland, where he grew up. He's mentioned examples where people lost their life savings at the bank that they had banked at because that bank was closed, but their mortgage for their house and maybe loans for their personal property, like for a car or something like that, were sent to a different bank in Cleveland, which was allowed to stay open. Of course, who made those decisions? Well, the Federal Reserve did, right? It's not like that's done by democracy, right? That's done by the financial regulator and the central bank. And so that bank still held your mortgage. You still had to make mortgage payments and car payments and so on, but your savings had evaporated because the bank you had deposited at had failed. And so this is sort of a taking that happened that was, I guess, legal, but seemed quite questionable from a juridical sense, from a legal sense, that you could, shut down a bank such that people lose their deposits, but keep their loans alive so that they still have to make payments. And so this gets to kind of the second order to think about, in addition to thinking about who are the intermediaries between you and your assets and what is custodied and can you own assets like Bitcoin or physical property that it does not require a custodian, but also to think about what kinds of loans you may have outstanding that might allow a bank or a financial intermediary to call as collateral to call away your property, right, to foreclose on your property. And so he gave examples of different family members in this book. He gave examples where they lost their savings, but because they had no savings, they couldn't maintain their house payments. And it was the Depression, so a lot of people lost their jobs. And so this bank that had consolidated the loans was now there holding their mortgage, and they foreclosed on their house. And he gave an example of a bank in Cleveland, the main bank that was allowed to survive, ended up becoming a very, very large asset owner, or the shareholders of this bank became a large asset owner of a lot of property in Cleveland through this foreclosure process. So it's sobering. And this is obviously an analogy of what the author's talking about in the modern era, which has a different sort of set of legal rails and a different set of kind of regulatory structures behind it. But the whole idea is to think about if there's a custodian between you and your stuff, that stuff can be taken, maybe. And it's worth thinking about that risk, how to deal with that risk. And these are some of the problems of modernity that I don't know the answers to, but I definitely think it's worth thinking about, not being alarmed by, but definitely thinking about and kind of wondering how you can improve your self-sovereignty in this modern era. Okay? As always, I thank you for listening. And if you have any thoughts on this book or if you disagree, definitely share it in the comments. All right? Thanks so much.